some organizations have certain days they celebrate. For us, the 4th of July is actually a very significant event. And in different years, we do different things. Sometimes we mail out cards to remind people, or do some other kind of celebratory event. This year, fortuitously, we were able to have this event tonight, which is close to the 4th of July. And the reason we were able to have it is because our guest speaker, Mark Skousen, is in town for some other business in addition to this event tonight. Actually, his son wrote the screenplay and is directing a movie here in Portland, and Mark is in town to make an appearance. Of all things, he's playing a professor, and apparently he played that role very well today. And so the heavy lifting is over and for him, and now he's going to address us. And this is a homecoming of sorts. Mark grew up in Portland. He's a graduate of Sunset High School. He is an economics professor at Columbia University. He's a widely published author, published in the Wall Street Journal, Liberty Magazine, Reason, Forbes. Has published more than 20 books. And of particular interest to tonight's topic, he's an 8th generation descendant of Benjamin Franklin. And his next book, coming out in the fall, is the completed autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. And he has one of his books over there, Modern Economics, The Lives and Ideas of Great Thinkers, which are on sale, and he'd be happy to autograph books later tonight. And so I don't believe in long introductions because you didn't come here to see me, you came here to hear Mark, and so Mark Skousen, we're honored to have you. Thanks.
All right. Okay, I think I'm going to use this, there we go. Hopefully, yeah, you can hear me okay? Yeah. Well, I'm a professor, and so as a professor, I like to kind of move around, look into your eyes, see if you're awake, see if I'm getting through to you, and I want to talk to you about something that I'm very excited about, 1776. The triumph of an idea is the theme, also known as the miraculous year. Annus mirabilis is how they say it in Latin. And many historians refer to 1776 as a very unusual year. And I've done quite a bit of study of 1776, and I brought with me as visual aids for my students a number of examples to show you how important this year is. So it's not just a year that's important for us Americans, it's also a worldwide event and has had a tremendous impact, and I'm going to try to make that case today that 1776 is a year that changed the world in many ways. So what we have up here is, of course, two books. A best-selling book right now, David McCullough's book, 1776, which came out just a month or so ago. I understand he spoke in Portland. He spoke in New York. I heard him a couple weeks ago. He had lost his voice, but apparently he has regained it. Anyway, what's interesting about McCullough's book is that it is exclusively a military history. And for me, while it was beautifully written, I think he made a mistake by focusing basically on the military history only. And it's a much broader topic than that. 1776 is not only a military revolution, but it is a political revolution, it is an economic revolution, a cultural revolution, a scientific revolution. And there's even a counter-revolution that starts in 1776. 1776 is the only year where 4 books were published in 1776 that became classics. And you can go into any Barnes & Noble, you can go into any Borders, you can go to Powell's bookstore, and you will find all 4 of these books there. They are up here. The first one, of course, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, came out in January. Then in February, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, extremely important work. Then in March, the next month, the Declaration of Economic Independence, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. So far I have listed 3 authors. What nationality? All British. Although I guess Adam Smith would consider himself Scottish. Then comes the 4th work, which you'll find in all the bookstores. And it's not particularly a book, The Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. And I have a more enlarged edition here that has a reprint of all of the various copies that Thomas Jefferson made. By the way, there is another book that was written for the bicentennial, 1776 Year of Illusions by Thomas Fleming, who is a fantastic historian, but perhaps not as good as storyteller as David McCullough is. But nevertheless, has a more comprehensive book. And for those of us who are looking at a worldwide view of what 1776 is about, I recommend Thomas Fleming's book because he has a whole chapter on the importance of common sense, a whole chapter on how the Declaration of Independence occurred, and both of those are unfortunately omitted in David McCullough's book. In fact, if you look in the index, you'll see Benjamin Franklin mentioned only 3 times, Thomas Jefferson twice, John Adams 3 or 4 times. And I think they deserve a lot more when we come to 1776. So for David McCullough's books, it's really more General Washington, 1776. And from that perspective, of course, it is a very good book. Well, what can we say about 1776 that would surprise you even more? In addition to these 4 bestsellers, and there's no other year, by the way, that has 4 classic bestsellers. So that gives you an idea of what this is about. A number of historians who have written world history have divided the world into various sections. And the modern world for many of these histories begins in 1776. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of charts which also demonstrate how important this year is. The first one, if you can see it, is a chart. It's taken from, I have a copy of it in my book, The Making of Modern Economics. But I wanted to just show you what happened in history after 1776. And as you can see here, we have a measure of GDP per capita, a measure of the standard of living, people's real income. And you can see that for centuries, there was no change. People lived the same life over and over and over again. And the whole concept of progress was contrary to the thinking of the common man. The common man realized that if you were not born under royalty or nobility, you had virtually no chance of ever progressing. And there was kind of a fatalistic attitude that most people had in this time period. That all changed in the 18th century. And you can see that as we enter into the 19th century, merely this whole century afterwards, you have this dramatic rise in the standard of living as measured by per capita income. And so you have to ask yourself the question, why did this occur? What was it that was unique about 1776 that within a generation you started seeing a dramatic rise in the standard of living? And such a rise in the standard of living that world population took off dramatically during that same time period. What was it that was occurring that allowed this to happen? Or is it merely a coincidence? I would like to argue that the philosophical, political, economic, religious changes that were made during the 18th century, culminating in this pinnacle year of 1776 had something to do with this dramatic rise in the standard of living. So what I'd like to do tonight is take a little bit of time and go through and tell you a little bit of the story of 1776 through the eyes of these authors who all had a different story to tell, and then perhaps a few other authors. Let me just highlight, I'm going to go into depth with some of these authors, and then I'm just going to pique your interest. They're kind of chapters in a book that I'm working on that was going to be called 1776, but somebody has stolen my title. So mine's going to probably be called The Spirit of 76, because I'd like to develop this concept of a multi-level revolution, if you will. So you could start, for example, on December 31st, 1775, December 31st, New Year's Eve, when the Lunar Society got started. Does anybody know what the Lunar Society is? The Lunar Society was established as a representation of the Industrial Revolution. This was a gathering, and you might wonder, lunar, what was that? Well, basically, they met whenever there was a full moon. This was not the story of Dracula or anything like that. This is the story of some great scientists. James Watt, for example, and Michael Bolton, who worked together as business partners and scientists to develop the steam engine. And we have many other scientists who would meet on a monthly basis. So they got started with this concept of meeting on a regular basis on December 31st. On January 1st, the great religious leader, John Wesley, delivered a sermon that kind of represents his dramatic impact. A lot of people don't realize the significance that the founder of the Methodist religion had in this revolution. Because you see, what did Wesley preach that was so different from all other religious groups? He preached a complete and total equality, true democracy before God, and that all men, women, children, kings, priests, all people had to work out their own salvation with God. No one was exempt. There was no hierarchy, according to Wesley's preaching. Many of the Methodists were very strong believers in the revolutionary spirit of 1776. They were also happened to be the wealthiest of the religious groups. And why was that? Because Wesley was one of the few who preached that there was nothing inherently evil in commercial society and making money. And he was famous for a very important sermon that he gave 30 years earlier. It's called the Sermon on Wealth. And in the Sermon on Wealth, he said there are 3 grand principles of wealth creation. And for those of you who are taking notes, students, take notes. Writing these things down. Do you have 10? All right, right. You can memorize. You can memorize. Okay. 1, earn all you can, he preached. Earn all you can. Unlimited earning power. Number 2, save all you can. Save all you can. You can never save too much. And number 3, give all you can. Give all you can. Now you'll notice that something that is part of the American psyche is left out of that 3-part equation. What is that? Spend all you can. Where is spend all you can? See, that's not in there, is it? This whole concept of earning all you can, we all believe in that. Saving all you can, well, I'm not so sure about that. In the Keynesian world, the credit card world, the consumer society, we don't really buy into that. But this is what he preached. And then give all you can. And there was another great founding father who really promoted these three concepts. Who was that? Benjamin Franklin. Poor Richard's Almanac. Penny saved is a penny earned. Many other aphorisms that he developed came very much out of this spirit of John Wesley. So those things are very important. Then comes January 9th, 1776. Thomas Paine's book comes out. And this was perhaps the most dramatic book as a pamphlet. I wish I had written this pamphlet. You know, as an author, if you want a classic that stands the test of time 100 years later, how about a pamphlet that is still in all the bookstores? You know how many pamphlets were produced in 1776? 400. Just in Philadelphia. How many of them are on can you buy at Powell's bookstore today? Even in the rare book section. Just this one. Perhaps only one other pamphleteer has exceeded Tom Paine. Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto. Find many editions of that in all the bookstores. And you can find many editions of Common Sense. Both on opposite ends of the political spectrum, I might add. But Thomas Paine's book was revolutionary. It's equivalent to selling 30 million copies today. 30 million copies. It sold 500,000 copies were made in the United States. Everyone read it. This book made the average person a political animal for the first time in American history, and probably the last time. Americans are not political. Americans are more interested in day-to-day affairs, taking care of day-to-day affairs. How do you get the average person to think politics more than once every 4 years or once every 2 years? And even then, do the majority actually vote? Lucky if they do. See, there's very little self-interest to engage in politics. But Tom Paine's Common Sense caused the average American to get interested in politics and become revolutionaries, to become radicals. Well, what was it he said in this pamphlet that caused them to do this? And by the way, 97% of Americans in the colonial time period could read. It's better than what we can do today. And that's without public education. It was all pretty much private back then. So what did he say in here that caused people? You see, prior to Common Sense, and by the way, when this came out, it was an anonymous pamphlet. He dare not put his name on it. And do you know why? Because of what happened to a friend of his, Dr. Benjamin Rush, was a medical doctor in Philadelphia. And about 10 years earlier, he had put out an anonymous pamphlet in favor of liberating slaves in Pennsylvania. And he actually, as a result of his pamphlet, got the Philadelphia Assembly to pass a law prohibiting the sale of slaves and the importation of slaves in Philadelphia. But then it was discovered that he was the author of this anonymous pamphlet. And guess what happened to his medical practice? He lost 2/3 of his patients. So when Benjamin Rush, who favored independence, said, somebody should write a pamphlet advocating independency, but it ain't going to be me. Let's give this rebel-rouser Englishman who has arrived recently who really doesn't really know what he's doing, we'll have him write the pamphlet. And so that was the beginning of Tom Paine's career. And so he attacked viciously the idea of a monarchy and why a kingdom was contrary to the best interests of Americans. And he quoted liberally from John Locke. John Locke, the 17th century political philosopher who wrote a, I think I'm going to get this to stand up here. There we go. Who wrote the second treatise on government, very important, that you probably all read in high school, perhaps in college. And in fact, at Sunset High School, Merrill Cressy was my political professor. See, I still remember his name. Harold Wick was my chemistry teacher. Why do I remember those names, by the way? Why would I remember names of professors who taught me at Sunset High School 40 years ago? You want to know the answer? Because they made me think. Professors who made me think. Merrill Cressy, even though we politically didn't agree on anything, he taught me a lot about, because we read the classics. So we read John Locke. How many have read John Locke, just by a show of hands? All right, well, it's not your best bedtime reading, but John Locke talked about the three great principles of good government. Good government is there to preserve and protect three great principles, and those are life, liberty, and property. I know most of you said pursuit of happiness. Why? The Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson removed the word property and substituted pursuit of happiness. Good idea or bad idea? Well, it's a pretty interesting argument that we're going to discuss a little bit later. But it's a debating topic. So John Locke emphasized government's purpose. We make a contract with government that government will protect us from life, liberty, or life, liberty, and property. Well, what was the King of England doing for life, liberty, and property? Not much of those three things. Okay, burning their homes, their houses, killing Americans, reducing their liberty, taking away their liberty, described in the Declaration of Independence, which was kind of the final straw, if you will. So it was a very powerful document. The other thing that's really interesting about Paine, and he took this again from John Locke, is separating society, which he saw as a voluntary group of individuals, and government, which was force, which was dangerous, much more dangerous that you can be forced to do things, rather than in a commercial society where we entice you, we persuade you through advertising and what have you to buy our products. But you're not forced to do so. In government, it's a very different story. And so government is a necessary evil at its best, said Thomas Paine. So we must be very careful. Well, this was a book that had such tremendous impact that it basically, we would not have had the Declaration of Independence if it wasn't for the book that came out months earlier in January 1776. So it's a book worth reading. And I read it when I was going to school at Sunset High School. I read Common Sense, and it made a lot of sense to me. And perhaps affected my attitudes that I have as an adult. Now let us move on to this rather fascinating volume, Edward Gibbon. the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. It came out in February of 1776. Now, there's some unique things about this book. First of all, this is an abridgment of 6 volumes. And so this is pretty heavy reading. I have a friend of mine, Doug Casey, who has read all 6 volumes and quotes from Edward Gibbon religiously, even though he's not a religious man. Gibbon's book is maybe, of the ones that I'm going to talk about, the one you're least familiar with. But it had a huge impact on this whole idea of the Enlightenment, the age of Enlightenment. You see, look at this title. He didn't call it the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, did he? He calls it the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And coming out in 1776, it wasn't lost on the British people that maybe there's a comparison here between the decline and fall of the Roman Empire and the decline and fall of the British Empire, which also was ruled by an emperor, by a monarch, if you will. And so this became an instant bestseller, sold out immediately, had to go back to press. And Gibbon, being a very interesting British true intellectual, a bookworm, Edward Gibbon would live, breathe. If Powell's bookstore was open 24 hours a day, he'd live there. And he was short, fat, got very little exercise, would tap his snuff box to get your attention. He did not want to be ignored if he walked into an audience. Never married. Fell in love with a daughter of a Protestant minister, but since his father was a devout Catholic, he would have been, if he said, if you marry this young woman, you will be disinherited. So Edward Gibbon says in his autobiography, I sighed as a lover, but I obeyed as a son. And he never fell in love again, never got married, confirmed bachelor, and he said, I was always in love with my books. And so on the steps of the ruins of the capital of Rome, he was inspired to write the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And he started a tradition. Many great philosophers have stood on the ruins of the capital of Rome and have had the inspiration to write a book that has had a profound impact. Like John Stuart Mill did this in the 1850s. And as a result, in 1859, came out with the book On Liberty, a book that you can find in every bookstore. Frederick Hayek, who was a devoted biographer of John Stuart Mill, thought 100 years later, I'm going to imitate John Stuart Mill. And so he ended up in Rome in 1954 and said, I'm inspired to write a book on liberty, and I'm going to call it the Constitution of Liberty, and it came out in 1960. So I'm thinking of taking a trip with my wife to Italy. My wife is here, by the way. I'd like to have her stand to introduce my wife, Joanne. She's my she is my editor par excellence, and so maybe we can take a trip to Italy, and she can come up with a great book on liberty. Anyway, so Gibbon started writing, and it took him 10 years to write the first volume that came out in February 1776. And why was it so, why did it have such an important impact with this concept of the Enlightenment? Well, basically, it starts with Marcus Aurelius, who wrote Meditations, the Emperor's Handbook, and talks about all the great virtues of the Roman society, the Roman Empire, and the Roman law, and their system of a republic. But he starts with Marcus Aurelius because it's all downhill after that. Within the next 50 years, 20 men all claimed the purple robes. Assassination after assassination, debauchery, licentiousness, war after war. Rome declined. And then came Constantine, and it declined even further. And the most controversial part is chapters 16 and 17 of Gibbon's book. And what does it say? What does it blame for the further, rather dramatic decline after that of the Roman Empire? He blames it on Christianity. Christianity. Constantine converting to the church and immediately killing his wife, murdering his wife and his sons. So Gibbon's view of Christianity is rather negative, whether justified or not. And so he scorns the monastery, the Catholic Church. He attacks it for their monasteries, for their refusal to be involved with civic affairs, for their interest in personal salvation rather than the salvation of your fellow man. And so, right or wrong, he has these chapters criticizing the Christian church. And so, another reason why this book became a very big bestseller and a very controversial book. The two virtues, the two principles, if you will, that Gibbon held on to was virtue and freedom. And included in freedom was this idea of a commercial, competitive society. He said, in a commercial, competitive society, ideas, science flourishes. See, part of the Enlightenment is the rejection of faith and the acceptance, the adoption of reason, you see, reason, as if the two can be separate. And the rejection of superstition of any kind. So, Gibbon is truly a man of the Enlightenment. And he belongs here in this 1776 as a symbol of this era. Now, one of the ironies, I mentioned before that the book, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, was viewed, are we in Britain, are we going through the same thing? We are fighting war after war. War with the French, war with the Dutch, war with the Prussians, war with the Americans, never-ending war, bankrupting us. And in doing this study, reading of Benjamin Franklin, and the atrocities committed by the British were something that a lot of us have forgotten. McCullough talks about it in his book, only for 1776. But just as an example, when General Washington lost this battle of losing over 1,000 men, 1,000 soldiers, in August of 1776, these men surrendered. They were taken prisoner. How many of them survived? You know what happened? One of the generals took these 1,000 soldiers, crammed them in on one of the what were known as hospital ships, put them on this ship, and left them starve to death and die. and these are, you know, I mean, war creates this kind of environment. It's not, you know, we can't look at ourselves and say we're lily white in this, although it is interesting that even in the American Revolution, we treated our prisoners, the British prisoners, far better than the American prisoners were treated. All the historians have recognized this fact. But anyway, what the irony is that Edward Gibbon opposed the Americans in the American Revolution. He was so conservative that he just could not see how important this independence was. Now we shift gears to a book that I consider an extremely important book in the history of 1776, The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Another thick, fat tome that requires quite a bit of reading, but here it is in paperback, a little Bantam paperback, unabridged. Take this for your summer reading to Seaside, Oregon, you see? How many of you would? Unusual. Why is it that this book, again, out of thousands of books were published in 1776, why would The Wealth of Nations still be published in many editions, by the way? You'll find it in many editions. Because this book, The Wealth of Nations, is a declaration of economic independence. Adam Smith, like Edward Gibbon, confirmed bachelor his entire life, a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow, and again took 10 years to write The Wealth of Nations. Recent portrait of Adam Smith. So why was Adam Smith such a classic? Why was it a declaration of economic independence? You see, in 1776, you have to understand a little bit about the anti-Enlightenment. The anti-Enlightenment. There were many people who were opposed to this age of enlightenment, this age of reason, this age of individuality. The anti-Enlightenment included the clergy, it included the leaders of government, and it also included many business people, merchants, known as mercantilists. Now, the religious people did not want freedom for individuals. Why? Because freedom meant heretics. Freedom meant atheists. Freedom meant you wouldn't go to church, which was required by law. It would mean social disintegration. So that's why the clergy opposed the Enlightenment. Government clearly, the emperor clearly, the monarchs, France and England and other countries opposed the Enlightenment because they knew that if people had the freedom to leave and create their own nations, they would, because they wouldn't be happy with what was happening in their country. So it would be political disintegration and disaster. And same with economically. Economically, the mercantilists were very Marxist in a sense, in that if you gave people economic freedom, they wouldn't buy the domestic products. They would buy foreign products. We can't allow that. If we gave people freedom to move wherever they would move, we would have a terrible problem called immigration. The wrong kind of people coming into our country. There would be, if you allowed wages to seek a market level, that would mean lower wages and unemployment and crisis. So there was great opposition to the main thesis that Adam Smith had. And what was his thesis? His thesis was give people their economic freedom, and 3 results would occur. Number 1, you would have economic growth. would see real progress if you gave people economic freedom. People would pursue their own interests, and in pursuing their own interests, they would be led by an invisible hand to benefit society. You have this concept of the invisible hand that you'll find mentioned in one page in that Bantam paperback. And your homework assignment is to find that page and email me what page it is. And if you do, I'll give you a reward. But I'm not telling you what the reward is. But it could be pretty nice. Okay? mskousen@aol.com. Email me, tell me the page, and you'll win something. Okay, invisible hand. I know what some of you are going to do. Just go to the index and look it up. You find it pretty easily. Yeah.
What was the page again?
Yeah, it could be that easy. All right, number one, you would see prosperity. You'd see growth. Number two, it would be universal. That not only would the rich benefit from capitalism, but so would the poor. Universal opulence. That would create wealth even for the lowest level of existence. And the third thing he promised was that you would have stability. Very much the opposite of what was predicted by mercantilists, by government. If you gave people freedom, you'd have chaos. He argued just the opposite. Instead of volatility, you would have stability. And all of these three arguments are debated even today. It is interesting. This is a study done by the Heritage Foundation. Actually, I think this is the one. Yeah, Heritage Foundation. What is this? It shows you as you give people more economic freedom, the income level rises. The income level, the per capita income level rises in nations that have greater economic freedom. Thus confirming the Adam Smith thesis of if you give people more freedom, they will have greater prosperity. And I've got other graphs to demonstrate the same thing in my book here, The Making of Modern Economics. In an appendix there, I discuss all three issues and what the debate is on that. And he didn't call his system laissez-faire, which is part of the French tradition of Jean-Baptiste Say and Frederic Bastiat and Alex de Tocqueville. They used the concept laissez-faire, leave us alone. Adam Smith used a very different concept. He called it the system of natural liberty. And why did he use the term natural liberty? Because he was imitating Sir Isaac Newton. Natural philosophy was what was called science back in those days. And Adam Smith wanted to create a system that was for social science, for human action. And he called it the system of natural liberty. And this concept of natural liberty is used a lot by Benjamin Franklin and others of the Enlightenment. So this system of natural liberty consisted of three parts. It consisted of freedom, competition, and justice, a system of justice. And if you had those three elements, the system of natural liberty would lead to higher standard of living for all and stability. And I think it has a lot of merit as far as his concept is concerned. Now, was he a defender? Was he one to condone greed and the fraud of businessmen, as some people allege? The answer is quite the opposite. In fact, he borrowed from Montesquieu, who argued in The Spirit of the Laws that competition moderates the passions, bridles the passions. Because if you're defrauded under competition, you can go to another business person. You can go to another business, another firm to buy your products. And this doesn't eliminate fraud, it doesn't eliminate greed, but it moderates it, it restrains it. It's a very powerful concept. You see, Adam Smith did not buy into the argument that we need to change the basic human nature. But we should guide it through institutional framework to guide it to act properly. Thus, the invisible hand, which is a very gentle concept, it's not the iron fist of Marxism. See, the iron fist is the symbol of the Marxists about capitalism. It's an iron fist. Adam Smith, it's an invisible hand. It's a godlike hand. It's a religious symbol. Is not God invisible? How many of us have seen God? But many of us have faith that a God exists. Some have great faith, some have little faith, some have no faith. We have varying degrees of faith in this invisible God, do we not? And equally, some of us have great faith in capitalism, that capitalism works. That if you give people freedom, they'll be better off. This is the triumph of an idea. 1776 is the triumph of this concept of individuality and freedom. And it is a very dangerous concept. I was talking today to the Cascade Policy people about some of the things that they advocate. School choice, personal savings accounts as part of Social Security. And what is the fear? What is the fear? Because there's always a fear factor, you see, against freedom. There's always the fear that if you give people freedom to use some of their Social Security money to invest it, what's going to happen? They are going to lose it. They are going to invest poorly. They are not going to subscribe to my newsletter. They're going to... a little carried away there in personal promotion. But this is the fear, isn't it? That people will lose that money. If you give people school choice, it will destroy the public school system. And some people are applauding for this. But see, there is this great fear, isn't there, of freedom? All right, let's make it a little bit more controversial. We legalize drugs. What is the fear? People will die, overdose, and they'll be on the front page of the newspaper. And those who voted for legalization, it's your fault. So let's make it a little more difficult. Open borders with Mexico. What is the fear? You see, I'm not telling you what is the right answer and the wrong answer to these things. I'm just telling you that this idea of freedom is a very controversial and dangerous idea, even today. So the battle, I'm calling this the triumph of an idea, and it's not really a complete triumph. But in a relative sense, it was a triumph. And therefore, we shift to, oh, I got to tell you one story about the Wealth of Nations. This came out March 9th, 1776. The day before in Birmingham, at Michael Bolton's factory, where they're making, with James Watt, his steam engine. His steam engine that 10 years earlier he had invented. This is the Industrial Revolution. This steam engine that James Watt invented. It is what gave us all of this Industrial Revolution of the future after 1776. But what's interesting is on March 8th, the day before The Wealth of Nations came out, James Watt's very first commercially viable steam engine became available in working form. Very symbolic in my mind, 1776. And for those of you who are familiar with the history of Johnson's The Life of Johnson. Any of you ever heard of The Life of Johnson? This is Samuel Johnson, the man of letters. And James Boswell writes this biography called The Life of Johnson. It's the most famous biography that's ever been written. Again, you'll find it in all the bookstores as a classic. Well, on March 8th, when you read it, it's a diary. And so on March 8, 1776, James Boswell, the biographer of Samuel Johnson, visits Michael Bolton's factory, steam engine, on the day that James Watt's engine is now available. And as he goes through the tour and is welcomed by Michael Bolton, Bolton says a very, very significant thing. He says, "What we have here is what everybody wants. Power." Very classic phrase to represent this time period. Well, last but not least, we only cover half of 1776, is, of course, the Declaration of Independence. And you have Thomas Jefferson, who at only the age of 33, who only came to the Continental Congress a couple months before that, and was assigned this monumental task of writing the Declaration of Independence. Why? Because he was trained from a very early age as in law, and had a unique ability to drafting resolutions. He had lots of practice and wrote this wonderful draft of a resolution regarding called the Summary of the Rights of British Americans. And he basically argued we're all Englishmen and we all have equal rights. And therefore, why are we not being given equal rights? Why are we being taxed without representation? And so forth. He made a very powerful argument. And so he was asked to write the Declaration of Independence. And actually wrote it pretty much himself. He did turn it over, after writing the first draft, turned it over to Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and several others who made small changes. One of the most interesting changes was done by Franklin. "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable," was Jefferson's phrase. Sacred and undeniable. A symbol of religious faith, the term sacred. Franklin, a child of the Enlightenment, scratches out sacred and undeniable and puts in self-evident. What is the theme of the Enlightenment? Rational science. Very simple change, but very symbolic. The other one, of course, is only Jefferson, of the John Locke trilogy, Life, Liberty, Property. He removes property and substitutes pursuit of happiness, which is very American. The idea of happiness is very personal. It's very much part of the Enlightenment. It's an idea that is very individual. Happiness. And property, you see. What did Jefferson think of property? Did you ever write to property? Well, it's a good question. We don't really know the answer to that. A lot of people have debated this issue. Well, what is this? Why is that left out? And it's interesting that Jefferson advocated later on in his life. In 33 years, he had much longer to live. Lived another 50 years and died on July 4th, 1826. During that next 50 years, advocated very clearly that every American had a right to 50 acres of property. And they should preferably be farmers. He loved farming, that was his. He didn't like city life at all. So that was his advocacy. So there's a little bit of a land reform going on with Jefferson. And he did not like the landed, even though he's from this aristocracy. I mean, he was born in an aristocratic family. He really did want to see. He didn't like these big estates being owned. I mean, look at George Washington, who owned thousands and thousands of acres. Ben Franklin himself begged the British government to give him a grant of land. He searched for it all his life and never got it, fortunately. But they give these land grants. At one point, this group that Franklin represented was going to get the whole state of Ohio. Fortunately, didn't get that. But that's how big these estates were and gradually being broken up. Land reform is a very big problem in South America and elsewhere. So anyway, there's this debate going on regarding Jefferson. It's a very interesting debate. I would like to end and take your questions after this, but let me end with the story of Benjamin Franklin. As John mentioned to you, I'm writing this the completed autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin's autobiography is the most successful, commercially most successful autobiography ever written. It's always been in print. It's sold millions of copies. It's affected. It's had a tremendous influence on the youth of Americans. And but what's interesting is he died before he could complete his autobiography, and he left out the last 33 years of his life, which includes the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress, the signing or the the convention, Constitutional Convention, and of course his 8.5 years as the minister, first ambassador to Paris, to France. And so what I've been doing is trying to finish his autobiography. This is a book that is in his own words. So I'm not just filling in and making it up like an historical novel. What I've done is I've gone to the papers of Benjamin Franklin that are being published year by year at Yale University. And I've gone through there and pulled out all these stories that Franklin is telling about himself in letters to his family and friends and so forth. And one of the interesting things I discovered is we never wrote about the Declaration of Independence. And can you imagine, here I'm trying to complete the autobiography, and so we skip over July 4th, and we go on to, I'm off my way to Paris. No, I couldn't do that. Well, I discovered that Franklin had, when he was in Paris, sat up one night with Arthur Lee, who was another one of the peace negotiators, the commissioners. And he talked eloquently about the last year and a half and what this experience was like as part of this Declaration of Independence. And so in it, Arthur Lee did a very good job of being very precise in the language that Franklin would use. And so I changed it from Dr. Franklin said to I said, without any other change. And it's a marvelous document. And he simply says it's a miracle in the affairs of men that we were able to accomplish this thing. Because for months we had no government, no laws, no military, no ammunition, very little in terms of weapons, no alliances, and we were able to accomplish this, the greatest revolution in the history of the world. And it really was a revolution, and especially his role as a peace negotiator to get France, according to the latest studies, to lend us, and was never paid back, by the way, lending the Americans $1.5 billion. And armaments and clothing. And did you know that every major battle that the Americans won had at least half the forces were French, and all the clothing that the Americans were wearing were French. You probably don't want to hear this today. The French people would love to hear this story. I suspect I'll be able to go over and give this speech. But this completed autobiography is going to be very revealing. Well, I will end with two quotes that I have uncovered in doing my research, and they're very applicable to today. And the first one is, a virtuous and industrious people may be cheaply governed. What does that say if we are expensively governed? Yeah. Which we are. And I understand Oregon is one such example. And I must say, I take my hat off to the Cascade Policy Institute, which is doing a great job and deserves your support in a great cause to make us, again, a virtuous and industrious people so that we may be cheaply governed. And the other quote is also very appropriate. The system of America is to have commerce with all and war with none. Thank you very much. Do we have questions? Yes, sir.
Well, thank you for the wonderful review of the philosophical underpinnings of our country, but I get the sickening feeling that our students today in high school and middle school and even college are not getting much of this, and in fact probably aren't aware of this, and if they are aware of it, they're aware that Jefferson had slaves, and we took land from the Indians, and Columbus raped the people. And, I mean, that's the stuff that my kids have been with from the 80s. What's going on in their school?
So was this, the story that I told, is this a new story? This is a story that's not being taught today?
I guess.
No, I don't. I think you're probably right. I mean, I haven't tried to. I've tried to portray an honest rendition. I guess I did not cover very much regarding the slave issue and that sort of thing. Yeah, I think there is a problem with the way education is taught today. I've certainly felt that in economics. When you see my own book and how the approach I've taken, I mean, it's an eye-opener when you see how Adam Smith is portrayed and Marxism. I have a chapter in here in Marx, by the way, that is called Marx Madness. And a little play on March Madness. And it says how Karl Marx plunged economics into a new dark age. So you kind of know where I stand on Marx, don't you? Anyway, the student, I had a friend of mine who I sent a copy of this to the Philippines. And a student who was at the University of the Philippines, which is a hotbed of Marxism, got a hold of this chapter. Was so taken with this chapter that he typed word for word the entire chapter online and sent it to all of his friends at the University of the Philippines, including his Marxist professors. His life was threatened after that. But it made a huge impact, including the conversion of one of his Marxist professors who had never seen the other side of these perspectives. So these kinds of things are really important. It's one of the reasons I write books. I can get up and give a lecture to adults. I can get up and teach a class to 60 students. But maybe writing a book, you can reach more people. And so that's one of the reasons that I write what I do. Yes?
How popular are you at Columbia University?
Well, I'm not teaching this fall. I'm on a rather quick sabbatical.
Talking about students and professors.
Well, my students rank me very highly. In fact, there's an underground rating service called culpa.info at Columbia University, and I'm one of the top 10 professors in economics. However, one of the the professor who's in charge of assigning classes and so forth said to a group of students, Skousen will not teach you. I have an uphill battle every semester, whether I teach or not, whether it's in economics or the business school or what have you. I mean, it is a serious battle. I'm also very, I get great support from the business community, great support from the students, but the faculty, it's another story. So it is an uphill battle. When it comes to, you know, being liberal in presenting all points of view, it's difficult for them to live up to that title. Yes.
You know, why is that in academia that, you know, they're all, everything's freedom of speech, but when it comes down to that, and if you don't agree with their thinking, they don't want you to teach. What?
Yeah, it is a hard time, you know, and I make that point. However, I think it's one of those things. I think there's an agenda. To be honest with you, I think there's very much an agenda among professors. I have seen Marxists come into departments and within 10 years take over the entire department, slowly but surely. There's an agenda there. Conspiracy, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I couldn't believe that the Marxists actually took over the University of Utah. I mean, you would think of all places, how would that happen? But it has happened. And there are other schools where that has happened. So whether it's Keynesian or what have you, they seem to be better organized than we are. So it's a constant battle. Even though the University of Chicago has done a wonderful job in winning Nobel Prizes and having an influence in promoting a market economy. And I have a whole chapter at the end of my book called Adam Smith Goes, or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, is what I call it. And it's the influence of the Chicago school that's had this tremendous impact. But still, it's a major battle out there in the academic world, and it's very tough to win these battles. Yes, sir.
We'll get back to Jefferson for a moment.
Okay.
Would you consider giving Jefferson a higher moral purpose in changing pursuit of property to pursuit of happiness? Since in 1776, in all the colonies except Vermont, it was legal to consider a human being as property. And enshrining in the Declaration of Independence the pursuit of property would also enshrine that slavery.
I think that's a very good possible interpretation. Again, we have to guess here because Jefferson never did answer this question, why did you replace pursuit of happiness or property with pursuit of happiness? That could be one reason, because you remember the list of things. He does mention slavery. And of course, he was willing to free his slaves once he died. And for financial reasons, he did not do so. So it's a mixed story there. You know, okay, you want to give Jefferson the give him support for standing on principle, but then he should have freed his slaves immediately if he stood on principle. And for financial reasons, he chose not to. So I'm not sure we can make your argument because of that. It sounds logical, but it may not be what he was thinking. Nobody really knows.
In the Declaration, between the preamble and the list of grievances, is essentially a description of the principles of civil government. In your opinion, what stands out as the most crucial principle described there?
I'm not sure. Did you want to tell me what you think, or?
No, I know what I think, but between we hold this is to be strong.
Well, I mean the whole idea of the contractual relationship, and that we as citizens have the right to rebel, which is very Lockean, if life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is denied us, is a very powerful argument. But of course, one must ask oneself, when do you reach that point of no return? When do you reach the point of saying, my taxes are too high, I am going to rebel?
Not for light and transient causes,
Yeah, which is very important. It's a, there is, I think, an extremely important issue. And it's interesting that Abraham Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address, when he says 77 years ago, what year is he talking about? He's not talking about 1787, when the U.S. Constitution was written, 1776. So I think it's that delicate balance which is really important. And even though our tax rates here in America, which is in a sense a representation of how much freedom and how much slavery we have economically, are 10 times, if not 20 times more than what the founding fathers faced, the American colonists faced. There doesn't seem to be a groundswell that we have another revolution. Jefferson at one point actually said we need a revolution every 20 years. He said a lot of things that I'm not sure he really believed. I don't think he really would advocate that. I mean, that's definite radicalism. That's French Revolution. And look what that gave us, you see. It's a delicate balance there. Yes, sir.
Would you say then that the idea of what followed this was a series of several dozen state constitutions and I guess what you call the corporate maxim of employees' roles are to maximize the wealth of the corporation? But there's an inherent contradiction there, which is why you have that, what you described as the business, government, society conflict, where it either should resolve itself according to the ideals, or it just possibly can't because there's too many things going on and preventing people from looking back to that foundation.
And let me just play out what I think you're trying to get at. The role of government in society. You have this idea that Tom Paine talked about, society, and then you have government. Hopefully they have the same ideals in mind. There's not a lot of conflict, hopefully. You really have three organizations. It's the way I look at it. You have government, which is to some extent voluntary. It's not all complete force. We certainly give allegiance to that. We vote for these people. So, and there's a lot of people who say, yeah, I pay a lot in taxes, and I can pay some more. Okay, so some people say that. And so voluntarily, no doubt they would pay more, one would think. But anyway, you have government there that is based on a system of taxation and to some extent mandatory requirements and rules and regulations and bureaucratic efforts. Okay? And they take care of many things in society. Social Security, Medicare, they're involved. OSHA, SEC, government regulations of Wall Street. You have all of this that represents government. And a lot of times that's all we think in terms of, well, how do we accomplish our goals in society? There's government. But then I take you to what Peter Drucker talks about, the great management guru, Austrian. There's a lot of Austrian economics in his thinking. He says, business is a viable and maybe even a better alternative, and actually can provide better services and better welfare services than the government can. So you have Social Security versus 401k plans and defined benefit plans. as difficult, the problems involved in there, they're nowhere near the problems that Social Security is facing. And the payouts are hugely different. And you have Medicare versus private medical insurance programs. And despite all the problems with the private medical insurance programs, they're a lot better than the Medicare. And Drucker says there's a message here. Government has difficulty solving problems. It takes forever for them to solve problems. I mean, if there is a problem and you want to turn around a company, Apple computer that was collapsing and so forth, or today, maybe, and now is making a major recovery, and GM, which is now in the throes of difficulties, there's no doubt in my mind, well, maybe a little doubt, that GM will get its act together and work things out and so forth. But government struggles, they just can't solve the Social Security problem until it's a total crisis. The same thing with Medicare, you know. Well, let's add prescription drugs. That'll help solve the problem. It's going to make it worse. We all know it. It's inevitable. Okay, so there's those two. But I will give you a third one that Drucker is very big on. He's even written a book on it. The nonprofit sector. And who is the nonprofit sector? It is the fastest growing. It's growing faster than government. And if it wasn't so inefficient, it would grow faster than business. But there's a lot of waste in that third sector. And but foundations, charities, churches, look at what they do as alternatives to government. Believe me, the Salvation Army has a much better welfare system than the government can ever have. Now, they don't do as much. They know what battles to fight, but they're very good at it. And there are lots of these organizations that are out there that provide these services. And where is our support? Keep sending, you know, why do we spend so much? Why do we give government so much? We need to give more money to business and more money to nonprofit organizations to do these jobs that they do a lot better than government. That's the way I see it.
So one more.
All right. One more question. Yes, sir.
I hate being the last question, but basically your speech was really the common man feeling on the street was individual liberty. And obviously some of us may feel that that's been a bit tarnished lately here. What do you feel has to happen for the individual man, the young person, the senior, the middle class, the middle-aged, to also have that same passion for individual liberty as there was in 1776? What one or two things do you feel need to happen in order for that to begin to reoccur, or for that idea to again become a little bit stronger maybe than some of us feel that it is right now?
You know, unfortunately, it seems to me that we're looking to government and our government leaders to give us some guidance there, to give us these freedoms, if you will, and test us to see if we'll do well. So we fight a war in Iraq. For whatever reasons we thought of in the past, now we're fighting the war in Iraq to bring democratic capitalism to Iraq, and really to the Middle East. That's really George W. Bush's legacy is that. That's what he wants as his legacy. I brought democratic peace and capitalism to the Middle East through war. And as contradictory as that sounds, that's what he's trying to do. That's the way I read it. Okay? So rather than through voluntary organizations, through the other two areas, business and even if it means McDonald's coming into the Middle East, okay? But you would be surprised how influential, how persuasive that is to developing the Western style of freedom and democracy has. And you can see it in the kind of clothes that are worn at meetings, official meetings. And what kind of clothes are worn by people in Asia, Middle East, Africa, the United States, Latin America? Suit and tie. Even in Saudi Arabia. You see that? I was looking at a Forbes article that this big, and some of them were wearing the traditional Arabic garb, but most of them were wearing the Western suit. And it's much more than just business. It's a cultural change. And then there's these the third sector, the nonprofit sector. And what are they doing? I wish we would rely as our political leaders and as individuals, instead of running the government, we would rely more on this. Just very quickly, how many of you know who Mohammed Yunus is, president of the Grameen Bank? Any of you ever heard of him? Now here's an example of a guy who has lifted millions of people out of poverty, and none of you have ever heard of him. Okay. And that's sad. So you ought to do a Google search on Grameen Bank. Mohammed Yunus, who's written a book called Banker to the Poor. Banker to the Poor. Great book about a man from Bangladesh who is involved with the microcredit revolution of offering these small loans to poor people. And when we say small, $100, $200, $300 maximum. And you wonder, what can you do with that? He is bringing millions of people out of poverty through his program. Non-government. He hates the World Bank. But he's been so successful that the World Bank has now created many microcredit programs to imitate this guy. And we ought to know more about these sorts of things. There is a lot that can be done short of this war type of environment that we constantly think, that should be the last resort. The system of America is commerce with all, war with none. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Professor Skousen. That was a very inspiring talk. And for me, whenever I have a chance to ponder for an hour and a half the great thoughts and writings of people from that era, the freedom fighters of 1776, it is for me very humbling. It makes me think a lot about what we're doing. And just remind those of you for whom you're not familiar with Cascade, our goal is to keep the torch alive and to continue to fight for these ideals today of freedom and liberty. And if you'd like to be part of that, we'd be honored to have you as a supporter. We neither solicit nor would we accept any money from the government. And also a reminder that Professor Skousen's, one of his books is over there for sale. If you have to autograph it. And he's also going to stick around and chat for a bit. So thanks for coming and enjoy the rest of the evening.